Okay, if I can call the room to order, please. Okay, it's Wednesday, the 12th of January 2022. It's the Budget Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee. As to the agenda in front of you, are there any comments from members of the public?
Thank you, Chairman. We haven't received any comments from members of the public.
Okay, thank you. If we can do a register of attendance, please, and apologies for absence. Thanks.
Yep, so we have received apologies from Councillor Rosemary Trollope-Bellew, Councillor Susan Sandal, Councillor Charmaine Morgan, Councillor Amanda Wheeler, Councillor Penny Robbins, Councillor Hannah Westrop, Councillor Rosemary Caby-Brown, and Councillor Judy Smith. Councillor Virginia Moran will be substituting for Councillor Amanda Wheeler. Councillor Helen Crawford will be substituting for Councillor Judy Smith, and Councillor Jackie Smith will be substituting for Rosemary Caby-Brown. And if you're happy for me to, I will do a roll call now. Councillor Graham Gill.
Present.
Councillor Ashley Baxter. Councillor David Bellamy. Councillor John Cottier. Councillor John Dawson. Councillor Phil Dilks. Councillor Paul Fellows. Councillor Gloria Johnson. Councillor Philip Knowles. Councillor Nikki Manterfield. Councillor Judy Stevens. Councillor Jill Thomas. Councillor Sarah Trotter. Councillor Dean Ward. Councillor Hilary Westrop. Councillor Mark Whittington. And Councillor Ray Wootton. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my mic weren't working. I am present though, as you can see. David Bellamy, Councillor David Bellamy. Thank you.
That's on.
Yes, I think the reason why the mics weren't working is because when Amy's got the microphone turned on to make the roll call, it cuts everybody else's off. Because I was noticing the lights were coming on and going straight off again. So I think that might be the reason. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. So we understand who's in the room and on the committee. Moving on to item 3. Item 3 is the election of vice chairman. Now, I should say that over, it should be said, many years this meeting has been held and the precedent has been set that the vice chair of the finance or the growth committee before that has always acted as vice chair on this. I should also say that Councillor Whittington and myself with the Assistant Director of Finance have met to help structure the meeting. And I see no reason to change that precedent unless there's any issues with that in the room. If there's no issues with that in the room, I should like to make progress. Okay, moving on. Item 4, disclosures of interest and dispensations. Are there any disclosures of interest or dispensations to be aired in the room? Okay, as a reminder, you can make a disclosure of interest or specify a dispensation at any stage in this meeting. Moving on to item 5, the action notes from the meeting held on the 13th of January 2021. Are there any comments on the action notes of the meeting held on the 13th of January 2021? Councillor Baxter? I can't actually see.
I'm sorry, Chair. There are some matters arising where something's been mentioned in bold action point in the text, but it hasn't made it through, I don't think, to the updates from previous meeting. I can't lay my hands on them right now because my paperwork has disappeared. So,
do you want to comment on those then when we speak about the updates from the previous meeting? We're just at this moment trying to establish whether that's a true and accurate reflection of the meeting held on the 13th of January. Are there any comments on that as a true and accurate reflection of that meeting? Okay, so do I have a proposer for those action notes? Councillor Whittington, do I have a seconder? Councillor Dawson, all those in favour? Any against? And any abstentions? Okay, so that is carried as a true and accurate reflection of the meeting held on the 13th of January. Moving on to the updates from the previous meeting. Councillor Baxter, do you need a minute or two to?
I don't know if any officer or member is going to speak to them first. Some committees, we get a paper that says, here are the actions all summed up into one page. But if you skip through the previous minutes and look at the bits that are in bold saying actions, and speak to each one, I'll be happy.
Okay, do we have Councillor Stokes, are you able to speak to these actions?
Well, with regards to page 7, 8 and 9, the actions on those, I mean, I think action 3 went to the companies committee. I think these were just putting it on to other committees because obviously this meeting is only an annual basis of a meeting. So I think all the other actions will have gone to other committees. So that's what I would say to those.
Councillor Whittington.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Would it be possible next year if we could just have a written report on the updates, if possible, just so we kind of sort of know, if they have been referred to other committees, great. I mean, I certainly know action 3 did go before the Companies Committee, but I think it would just be useful for clarity just to help us along. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I also suggest that before next year, i.e. in the next week or so, before the budgets are set, that we just have these summarised in a table as to where those actions live. I think Councillor Whittington is talking about the format of the report. Are there any of these actions that we have concerns upon? Councillor Baxter.
Yeah, so just running through them, did the relevant cabinet member provide a response to the suggestion of a parking cost reimbursement scheme? If so, where can I find a copy of it? Did Councillor Knowles meet with the cabinet member? Councillor Stokes has addressed number 3, but number 5, the terms and reference of the minutes of the housing board meetings to be circulated to members. I don't remember receiving that. If somebody can tell me when or where it was sent to me, I'd be happy. Yeah, maybe not in this meeting, but I'm certainly interested in the housing board meetings. And I don't remember seeing them since. I may be wrong because we all get lots of emails, don't we?
I think it's true that some of these have been referred to committees. I think we need to close that loop and see a report as to where they've been referred to and where those actions have been taken. Can we take an action to receive that in the next couple of weeks, please?
And can I also ask a question of procedure, which is that there was an excellently chaired joint scrutiny group for the Deepens Leisure Centre. Where would the minutes of that ever, or the action notes of that ever end up? They were incorporated into the report that went to the future meeting. What I'm saying is we had a meeting. We don't know if it's ever going to happen again. So where does the actions and the notes from that meeting land?
Karen Bradford.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Baxter, for that question. Yeah, we did have a joint committee, which was, of course, a one-off, and it's not on the annual calendar schedule for dealing with the Deepings Leisure Centre. Of course, the notes from that were reported through the council meeting, wasn't it? Was it the council meeting, wasn't it, on the 14th of December? Yeah, but if we feel that you want any more scrutiny of that, but it was reported in the information pack for the 14th of December. But if you want any more information on that, then you could take them back to the individual scrutiny committees if you feel like that you need any more information on that. But that was a one-off and it's not on the normal calendar of meetings, as this meeting is on the normal calendar of meetings.
I think that would be useful to refer those back to the committees that were involved in that, just so that they can all confirm that it was a true and accurate reflection of that meeting as much as anything. Are there any other comments on the action notes that will be forthcoming? Councillor Knowles.
Thank you. The answer to Ashley's question about did the meeting between myself and a cabinet member take place, the answer is yes. The meeting took place some months after this meeting, long after the budget had passed for last year. And we got some vague assurance. I brought my town clerk down to the meeting. We got some vague assurances about the issue I was raising, but subsequently nothing has happened. And I understand at this stage, it's not been included in the budget for this year, and I'll be raising it in the budget discussions later on in the meeting.
Okay, with that, I'd like to make some progress if there are no other comments on these action notes. And as I say, I'd like the action taken that we'd like to see a summary of that so that we can understand where they went to. So moving on, the budget proposals, item 7. As already mentioned, I met with Councillor Whittington and the Assistant Director of Finance in an attempt to structure this quite lengthy report and complex report, which I do think is getting better as the years go by. On your desks, you will see a printout of the order of items for discussion, where we'll accepting questions in effectively 6 areas. The first part is in the funding position. The second part is in the general fund budget proposals. The third part is in the housing revenue account. The fourth part is in the capital programme, including financing, of course. The fifth part is in reserves and balances. And then finally, just any other areas that may be in there. So we've decided to structure those reports into those 5 areas with a 6th area if you miss anything in one of the previous headings. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Councillor Stokes.
Thank you, Chairman. So the report sets out the draft proposals for both the general fund and the housing revenue account for the forthcoming financial year 22-23. The report covers both the revenue and capital reserves and fees and charges proposals. The report is presented today at the Budget Joint OSC meeting, and the findings of today will be presented to Cabinet tomorrow. On Friday, a 2-week consultation will be undertaken with our businesses and residents in respect of the council tax setting proposals to receive their views and feedback on the council tax levels for 22-23. Cabinet colleagues have been working with senior officers since September to formulate the budget proposals, and this has been challenging in the context of a 1-year only settlement from government, a figure which was only announced on the 15th of December 2021. However, we are pleased to see that the funding announcements were in line with our expectations, and so the announcements did not change our proposals in front of you. However, as it is only a 1-year deal, then future financial uncertainty remains beyond the 12-month period. Table 3 on your pack shows an unbalanced position beyond next year, which is due to 2 key factors: the unexpected changes to the government funding formula, and from 24-25, the borrowing impact following the decision to invest in the Deepings Leisure Centre. Tables 4 and tables 5 show the proposed changes to the budget proposals that are necessary to continue to deliver the quality services and the ambitions of the corporate plan, and the savings that are proposed to ensure a balanced position can be achieved for the forthcoming year. Table 6 presents a summary of the fees and charges proposals for the next year, and Appendix B provides the details at the service level. The proposal for funding levels for each of the council-owned companies is presented in the report, and details of the objectives of each companies for the next year. Companies Committee will be receiving further information with respect to the business plans at their meeting on the 25th of January. You will also notice within the report there is nothing in respect to the food waste trial. But given the tight budgetary outlook, it's proposed that the food waste collections are suspended until the national food waste collection service requirements are rolled out nationally. With this in mind, no provision has been made within the 22-23 budget. Although the council has been supportive of the service and has taken steps to maintain the current food waste collections to aid the future transition to the full statutory service, significant investment would be needed to continue into 22-23. As there's a 50,000 annual cost plus the additional vehicle maintenance on the 2 ageing vehicles. We are still awaiting DEFRA's response to their consultation conducted in summer 2021, and there is no clarity on the future requirements or timescales, which may be later than previously anticipated. We as a council will keep this under review and bring forward proposals as appropriate when DEFRA confirms the requirements. But I will now hand over to Richard Wiles, who will cover the main elements of the report. Thank you, Chairman.
Richard Wiles.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it helpful if I go through the structure of the sheet that's in front of members and then pause at each particular element?
Yes, please.
Okay, so just in terms of the overall funding, and we're talking general fund revenue specifically, as has been highlighted, the government have announced provisional figures. They were done just before Christmas, and they're in the period of consultation. And as largely expected, it is a 1-year proposal that's on the table. There are elements within that reaffirm the government's commitment to support councils through the current period, and that they're referenced in something called a services grant and something called a lower tier services grant. They're not grants the council has seen before, and they are to reflect where the government is readjusting how it funds councils going forward. The announcement also confirms that for district councils, £5 is on the table for 1 year only again, and the proposal in the papers is that the recommendation to set council tax at £5 is taken forward. And within the settlement, it also reaffirms that the government is mindful that for rural areas, there is a disparity between funding and the cost of services, and there's something called a rural service delivery grant, which is referenced in there as well. So bringing all that together in table 1, members can see that largely 22-23 from a funding perspective is the same as 21-22, which when you think of the other pressures the council is facing, particularly around inflation, workforce costs and other pressures, then they're not coming through on the announcements being made. What's interesting to note as well on table 1 is nearly 58% of the overall funding is actually coming from council tax. And the government, when it does its core spending power, which is what it calls funding available to councils, it makes the working assumption that each council will take the maximum council tax on the table. So they build that into their assumption. You can see that in the table where the funding moves from 8.1 to 8.4. So clearly, if councils choose not to take the council tax increase that's offered, then our core spending power would be reduced accordingly. So more and more the direction of travel is that the government funding reduces and the reliance on local council tax and local receipts increases, and that's been a pattern that's been established for a few years. So table 2 just explores that a little bit further and gives you a sense of what that might look like. There's 2 components when we set our council tax elements. There's the tax base increase, which is where more properties come to the fruition in terms of sign off and residents taking occupancy and paying council tax. So that's the tax base. And then there's the Band D charge, which is our part of what we levy on our residents. And that is moving to a figure of about 8.4 million if the £5 is taken. And members will note that of the council tax that's sent from this council, only 9% of it is our share. The majority of it is the county council, and the other component is the police and crime commissioner. So there's elements, and then above that there's town and parish. So more and more council tax becomes a major part of our funding source. The other bit to note is in respect of business rates. The council for many years has been part of the Lincolnshire business rates pool, and the proposal is the council remains a key partner in the business rates pool, and from 22-23 South Holland will rejoin the pool. They stepped out of it last year because of some pressures on their tax base, but they are seeking to rejoin the pool. And what that means is any growth, economic growth in the Lincolnshire area is largely retained and shared across the partners in the pool. So everybody who expects to see growth in their districts will want to join in that pool because those savings, those benefits financially are shared amongst pool members. So the proposal is that continues into next year. So I'll probably pause there, Mr. Chairman, in terms of setting the context for the overall funding. Thank you.
Okay, so we're effectively spoken about the area from page 12 to 17 in your report. Sorry, top of 15 in the report. Do we have any questions about the funding position? Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if I can ask Richard a question about table 2, please. The third line down, Band D charge, brackets SKDC only, including special expense areas. Is that correct, or should it be excluding special expense areas? Because if it's including special expense areas, that number should go down because Bourne is including their special expense area in their budget for this year and not in the SKDC budget. Am I right in thinking that?
Richard.
Sorry, it is correct. The government doesn't recognise special expenses outside of the overall council tax for the authority. So the authority's council tax has special expenses included in it. The reason why it doesn't show any reduction is because the movement from the special expense area of Bourne being taken out has been replaced by the SK element being increased. So overall, the funding for the council remains the same. It's just the SEA part for Bourne has been removed, but been replaced by the SK element.
Includes the SAA in its budget as it puts it to SKDC this time. Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, are there any other comments about the funding position? Councillor Baxter.
Thank you. I trust that the business rates pool is a good idea, but I ought to understand it, and so I'd like a little bit more about it. I think I was all right until you said that South Holland had dipped in and dipped out. Before I go any further, do I need to declare an interest as a county councillor?
Alan Robinson.
No, I don't believe that you do now, Councillor Baxter.
Okay.
Smashing. So 40% of it goes to the county council, hurrah, and the rest of it is shared between the other pool members who are pretty much the district councils with or without South Holland. So if we have growth in Lincolnshire, we get a share of that pot. Is our share related to our population or our number of businesses or the amount to which we generate our own business rates or our level of growth? How is it divvied up once it's in the pool?
Richard.
So I'll attempt to explain this in a way that is understandable. So basically every authority has a baseline assessment, which is called a baseline need. So that's what the government anticipates you will require and collect for your council tax, for your general fund costs, which is what we've got in our table 3. Anything above that is called growth, business rate growth. And of that growth, so for every pound of growth, 50 pence of it goes to the government, and the 50 pence that's remaining is shared amongst the pool in the way that's just been described. So 40% of that growth will go to the county, the 60% will be shared amongst the members. So everybody who has growth, that growth gets contributed to the pool and then shared equally. So if everybody's in a growth situation, that's a positive because everybody's moving at the same pace. Each year, every council will do an assessment of its economic base, its business rate economic base. And if it has any concerns, sorry, I should have muted that. If any councils have concerns about appeals that may be relevant to their business rate base, they will seek to remove themselves from the pool, because if they're in a loss position, so they fall below at their baseline need, they go into something called a safety net. And it's better to be out the pool because the government will help the safety net and financially support them. If they're in the pool and they fall below their baseline need, other pool members will contribute. So South Holland took the only course available to them and to support their colleagues across Lincolnshire was to take themselves out that pool because of their assessment that they will fall below. And their reassessment now has cleared them of that concern, and they're now able to rejoin the pool, and the other pool members will welcome them back in. So basically, it's everything above the baseline need is shared and shared locally, and then those that are in difficulty will come out of it to protect the others. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. It does help. I think I get it. I'll save any further questions for outside this meeting.
And if you can just comment on the second part there, how do we share in the growth? Is that equally dispersed?
So it's for every pound above the growth. So there's your baseline at 0. For every pound above, 50 pence of that, 50% goes to the government, and the remaining 50%, 50 pence, is shared amongst the pool members in the way that the report says.
Fine. Councillor Dill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Richard, for the presentation. I know you've only just started, but thank you anyway. You mentioned obviously that, well, actually, we've been used to multi-year settlements, and now we've got the one-year settlement. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the impact of that and you know, the possible challenges that presents. Thank you.
Richard. I mean, the context of the one-year settlement is primarily because the government has committed itself to doing a funding review, and that's on the business rate element, and it's on what they call the fair funding review, which is their acknowledgement that the way that the distribution currently operates is out of date and not fit for purpose, and it's been tinkered with for at least 10, 15 years and built on, which is why you get these grants now that kind of overlay it. So rural services delivery grant is a recognition that the funding mechanism is not fit for purpose and doesn't duly recognise the cost of delivering services in rural areas, and where there's demographic challenges, economic challenges, etc. So that's part of the thinking why there's the one-year review, and of course it's part of the thinking of how the government will respond post-pandemic and how it will realign its finances. Well, of course, what that does is it means the council and all councils can only really undertake a medium-term financial plan on a 12-monthly basis. So it can't really look any further forward than March 23, which is why in the table 3, you can see in the way that Councillor Stokes introduced the report, you can see that it puts us into a pessimistic position financially, because we have no certainty at all beyond the next financial year as to what the funding levels may be. Of course, it may not be as pessimistic as it's set out, but equally it could be worse still. So the clarity hopefully will come forward during this next financial year, when these consultation documents start to come to life a bit more.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions on the general fund position? I just have a couple of questions. Can you comment on why the drainage rates are rocketing? They seem to be going up by 15% for some reason. But why are they rocketing individually? And also, if you can comment on the new homes bonus, why that's dwindling away, these 400 figures, are they estimates or are they accurate figures on those?
Okay, so in terms of drainage rates, we have no direct control over the levies that are placed on the council by the drainage boards. So 3 drainage boards in the area of South Kesteven, they meet and they will set as a constitution their requirements in this area, and we have been written to be put on notice, if you like. There are some real pressures within the drainage board industry, and the pressures they've got around flood prevention works and ageing stock and ageing assets. So we have been notified that we can expect some increases above inflation. There are some members, obviously, of the council that sit on drainage boards who are more qualified than me to comment on that. But they are a levy imposed on the council that the council is under a requirement to pay back. So there is an ongoing dialogue, but we have no direct control over what those rates may be. In terms of new homes bonus, the government has said for a while now that scheme is effectively abolished. And what we're seeing is the tail end of that scheme coming to an end. So we're at the kind of cliff edge now of that scheme ending. And those projections are based on local government, the latest government announcements, and are largely legacy payments of previous years' housing growth in the area. So we are definitely coming to the end of that scheme. The government have suggested there is going to be a new iteration of new homes bonus, but as yet there's no clarity as to what that might look like and whether this council would particularly benefit from it.
Okay, thank you. With that, can I ask you to move on to the second point, the general fund budget proposals and bids, please?
So the general fund budget proposals start at table 3 on page 15. And has been said by Councillor Stokes, show beyond next year we're legally required to present a balanced budget, which is what's proposed for 22-23. But beyond that, we unfortunately are projecting a deficit, and as being said, the impact of the leisure centre decision made in December starts to come through, and you can see that on lines that are labelled as interest payable and minimum revenue provision brackets MRP, and you'll see those figures in that column. Now, of course, that could change years depending on when the refurbishment of the leisure centre takes place. So that may change, but for the purposes of the presentation, we've introduced it so members have got some full visibility of what that figure might be when it does actually take place. So beyond next year, we are still presenting an unbalanced position. And in order to get to a balanced position for next year, there have been a number of proposals brought forward, a number of savings brought forward, and a number of changes to fees and charges brought forward. And they're categorised in tables 4, 5, and 6. Probably ones just to note in table 4, particularly for members noting, is the reflection of asset maintenance, which has been a recurring conversation this year. There's been an injection of 400,000 to accelerate maintenance of assets. That's shown in table 4, and an ongoing 150,000 to invest in leisure centres primarily. And members will know there's a comprehensive survey being done at the moment in all the centres, and we would expect that 150 to be allocated and utilised against the findings of those survey works. Climate change, which up to date at this point has been a reserve, has been put forward into the main budgets at £20,000, and on the back of the council motion to support mental health awareness and initiatives, £10,000 has been allocated to support that. Community awards, that was a one-off initiative this year, has been proposed to be built into our base budgets from next year. And Grantham Carnival, which is some funding given to the Carnival to support the delivery of that, has been reintroduced as a proposal from next year as well. That's funded by the Grantham Special Expense Area rather than general taxpayers. Local plan, there's some injection of funding needed to progress the local plan, and we're suggesting that could be funded partly from reserves and partly from legacy grants. Leisure management fee I'll come to when we talk about the company proposals. And on the back of the council motion to do the community governance review for Grantham, £20,000 is being proposed to be put forward to fund the necessary consultation and other works associated with bringing forward a decision around that. So in terms of offsets and some savings that are going to be required to meet those new costs, and of course this is all overlaid with the usual pressures we see in our budgets, and they're on table 9, but you'll see in the chairman's already alluded to things like drainage board levies have increased disproportionately, pay awards, things like that. There's a proposal to realign the street scene teams to one dedicated team for the district. There's a proposal to remove the ward member grant scheme and direct the funding or the requests for funding into the existing community fund scheme, and to reduce the festival programme from the previously annual allocation of 100,000 a year to 80,000 a year, but retaining an annual festival programme around that new figure. The more significant changes to fees and charges are in respect of car parking, with a proposal to increase by 10 pence each tariff for the chargeable areas of Grantham and Stamford, and to introduce a £5 increase on the costs associated with the green waste collection service. And members will be aware, primarily the pressures in that service are around fuel, maintenance of vehicles, and the workforce costs. So there's a recognition of those increasing costs and a £5 proposal to increase green waste from next April. There's a proposal to introduce a new charge around street naming and numbering, which will be a developer specific cost going forward rather than the general taxpayers picking up that service cost. All other fees and charge proposals that are in the pack at Appendix B are primarily driven by the costs of increases in delivering those services. That's on a cost neutral basis, but it's to keep pace with the service user or with the principle of the service user directly contributing towards the cost of delivering those services. And that's £100,000, but that will be an offset against the cost increases in those areas. So they're the key proposals around bids and savings of fees and charges. Thank you.
Councillor Moran.
I'm sorry about this. When I first read through this report, I saw something about replacement of the fleet of vehicles. I can't find it anywhere now, but I believe it's in there somewhere. I'm just interested really in sort of more detail of where the fleet is at the moment. Is it replacing diesel vehicles with electric vehicles, where there would be some savings on fuel, or is it just a standard 3 or 5 year turnaround on the vehicles? Because I know normally from my accountancy days, you write down a vehicle over 5 years. Can somebody explain to me what we're looking at spending on changing the fleet?
Richard.
So yeah, fleet replacement's always in the capital programme because it's a rolling replacement programme. The current life of the assets are 7 years. We depreciate over 5, but we actually keep them over 7 because we have in-house workshops and we've got the skills within the workforce to retain those vehicles for longer, so we can actually replace on a longer profile. In terms of the vehicles we are procuring, I'll just turn to Gary. There is a fleet management strategy which we use to replenish the vehicles within. But Gary, perhaps explain better how that works.
Gary.
Thank you, through Chair. Yes, I mean, we have a range of vehicles in terms of our RCVs. Actually, it's 8 years that we currently are operating on a replacement program. It's probably about the extreme end of that we can do. But as Richard says, we've got the workshop that keeps them up and running. And we have that replacement program across the whole fleet. We've got different arrangements at the moment. RCVs for a rural urban mixed area subsidies aren't, in terms of the electric vehicles, anywhere near kind of at the standards we need in terms of the mileage that they can do and the services. So we're not at that point yet, but that will come in years' time in the future. In terms of some of the other elements of our fleet, that is something that we actively look at. Of course, we do have pool car vehicles, a couple that are electric, and we are looking at some of our light vans, etc. We are hoping to have a free government-funded external support to do a review during the year on our wider fleet in terms of opportunities that are both here now, but also coming in the near future, so that we can make sure that we're using the capital budget wisely to transition at the right point and over time. But obviously you don't want to go too soon because that's higher cost and isn't always the best carbon footprint benefit. But hopefully that answered your question.
No, I'm very impressed that we keep the vehicles as long as we do. It was just such a fleeting comment on it. I wasn't sure whether it was sort of a policy that, right, every 5 years they all go and we get all new and this, that and the other. And I do understand your reluctance to just try and replace everything with electric, because it's something we've looked at town council, and the type of vehicle that we use, there isn't anything electric at the moment. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions in this area? Councillor Baxter.
Thank you. So going through the bids, obviously I welcome the fact that we've got a climate change budget and a mental health initiatives budget. I think this is a budget bid. Are we saying that because it's, how much confidence does Councillor Stokes have that each of these bids will kind of win? The expression bid kind of makes you think it's competitive. So are these being presented as we've got the money for all these bids and we're going to put it? That is the case. Okay, great. So it's not we get climate change or this week's bid winner is mental health or whatever. On the SK Community Awards, I wondered if somebody, perhaps Councillor Cook, could comment on the impact of the lottery since it began, whether or not it has achieved or exceeded its expectations, and what the net impact on the council finances has been of SK lottery SK, I can't remember what it's called. The asset management maintenance program, that's an HRA issue. isn't it? Even though halfway down page 16, it says asset maintenance process. Oh, sorry, general fund asset okay, but for housing and property. So it's the proper.
Councillor Stokes.
No, that is for general fund. It's to do with the assets we hold, nothing to do with the housing side. It's just that it falls in the Directorate of Housing and Property.
Thanks for clarification.
So
Councillor Baxter.
that's kind of stairwells and grass and things that aren't actually houses. Is it? I'm trying to work out.
Councillor Stokes.
It's the buildings, the properties we own, such as this building, for instance. It's that sort of property.
Okay. I was confused by in the Directorate area column it says housing and property. So it's yeah, my mistake. It's worth mentioning that the community governance review of Grantham to create a Grantham parish or a Grantham town, that's being paid for by all of South Kesteven, not just from the Grantham SEA or from the charter trustees. I get that, I understand that, but just want to sort of mark that down as being a Grantham issue that's being paid for by all of us, and it's welcome, by the way. And finally, the ward member grant scheme. I complained when the ward member grant scheme was introduced in the year before an election, so I can't really complain when it's taken away in the year before an election. The festival programme is being reduced by £20,000. Can you say which festivals that's likely to affect, if any?
Councillor Stokes.
Well, all it's doing is it's reducing the actual budget allocation to that. I mean, there's still going to be 80,000. That'll be used for whichever festival. There's no set festivals for that money.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room in this area?
The lottery question hasn't been answered.
And the lottery question, thank you. Councillor Cook.
Thank you. I can provide an email update on that and I'll ask the cabinet member responsible.
Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chair. I think people will know I'm going to refer to what I mentioned before. This has been recurring for a couple of years now. I don't want to go through the history of it because it's a long history, but several years ago there was a promise made in writing, that a promise was made that Bourne would get a new cleaner for the town centre, and that 50% of that share of that cost would be shared with SKDC. This was proposed actually by an SKDC cabinet member at the time. It's no longer a cabinet member. The minutes of this meeting last year, it says that I would then meet with a cabinet member and with the leader. Subsequently, I didn't meet with the leader, but I met with the cabinet member and a member of his staff. I think you're here today. Yes, is that right? And there was no promises made at that meeting, but I think it was clearly understood of what had happened to this thing and why it had not happened over the years. It became very clear. I have very, very detailed notes with notes of minutes of meetings, of records of minutes, records of when everything was done. And it turned out that when the agreement was originally signed in August of one year, by September of that same year, it had been taken out of the budget. Now, at the time, I suspected all sorts of wizardry and ill feeling to take that out. But it turns out it was just purely an administrative thing. Very, very briefly, originally, SKDC were going to employ the person and Bourne were going to contribute 50%. We persuaded SKDC that we should employ the person and SKDC would pay 50%. When it came out of the personnel budget, it didn't go into any other budget. So between August, when this agreement was signed, and September, when the budget process started for next year, it got lost. And then for years, I've been chasing this, and for years, we've been all sorts of excuses or reasons why it shouldn't happen. And those reasons were all false or red herrings. The real reason, it was in the personnel budget for SKDC, and a month later, when you started doing the budget, it wasn't. Now, at the meeting I had with Gary and with the then cabinet member, I will sort of give them some encouragement that they understood the situation, they understood where we were coming from. There were no guarantees given at all, but there was a sort of indication that would be looked upon favourably, and there may be another fund from which some money could be taken during the current year to allocate to Bourne, because what the request was at least considered to be reasonable. I hope you'd agree with that, Gary. And it was sensible and it was agreed. And to me, it's about integrity. It's about promising something and then doing it. That's more than the money. We've actually employed this guy for 3 years, near enough, 2.5 years. So we've been paying all for it when there was a promise made by SKDC not to do it. Subsequently, we were told there was no money available in this budget, but I got approached in the Mears by somebody and said, we'll look at it as favourably as we can for next year's budget, which is the budget we're now considering. And I noticed that it's not been included, not only in the budget proposals, but not even in the bids for budget proposals. Now, I have brought this up at companies, as you will know, to finance, I'm sorry, several times. I was unable to attend the last finance meeting, so I asked for it to be brought up on our behalf. It was brought up by the independent group formally, and yet there's no mention of it again in the budget. And I fear it's just going to be brushed under the carpet. And when it comes to the end of the day, they'll say, well, we're on a tight budget, we can't do anything, therefore it's gone for another year. I've tried this for 2 years and it's not happened yet. And I want an assurance that this time it will be looked at very sensibly with the facts known and very favourably, because this was a commitment made by SKDC cabinet and the cabinet member 3-4 years ago, and we've gone 3 or 4 years without it, and I'm not prepared to let it go on for us any longer. I will not go away.
Thank you, Councillor Stokes.
Yeah, I know the history of this, and in my new portfolio, well, I've had it a while now, with waste, I will pick this up and we will have a chat about this, because me and Gary have been discussing this, and we'll come back to you, if that's okay.
Sorry, I'm happy with that. But having a discussion last 2 years, I've been promised a discussion, and the discussion came about in May after being raised in January. So I was offered a date the first year in May. There was the first opportunity to meet with the then cabinet member. And I'm not going to wait till May again. It's got to be in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Is that likely to be before the next finance meeting? Councillor Stokes.
I can confirm we will have that chat within the next 10 days.
Okay, Councillor Dilks.
It just would seem to be helpful if that were noted in the notes that this meeting is going to send to cabinet tomorrow, would it not? So that it's not forgotten again, you know.
This meeting is being minuted. Thank you very much, Councillor Dilks. Were there any other comments? Councillor Wotton.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. If I could refer you to page 16 and page 27. I'm talking about the Grantham Carnival grant of £6,000. As you know, Mr. Roy Wright, who ran the carnival for many years, stood down because of lack of funding. I note on page 27, you're talking about increasing the special expense area reserves by 305,000. If somebody else came along wanting to run the carnival, would that £6,000 increase? Because that's our money, Grantham Borough's money. Thank you.
Richard.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understood the question. The reserve that's referenced on page 27 is for money set aside to fund the whole of the SEA where unexpected costs arise. So, for example, in the past, we've had difficulties with grey water at the cemetery site, which obviously takes hundreds of thousands of pounds to remediate. So that's a deliberate reserve that's built up to fund one-off works, be it the Wyndham Park improvements, Dysart Park, etc., etc. The £6,000 that's been reintroduced as a proposal is because there's been growth in the Grantham area, so more properties have come onto council tax, which means there is now budget headroom in the SEA to allow that 6,000 to go forward if that's what members ultimately decide. So the two aren't necessarily interlinked. If council decided not to approve the £6,000 in the budget for next year, then there would be a little bit more surplus in the SEA, and therefore, yes, that 6,000 would go to the reserve.
Thank you for that, Richard. I mean, what I'm saying is the special expense fund comes from the Borough of Grantham. So I know there's more than 305,000. So if there was a demand or somebody wanted to come along to run the Grantham Carnival, would that £6,000 increase? Is there any funds from that excess money to go towards the carnival?
I mean, ultimately, that's a council decision, but in theory, yes, there's a surplus reserve for the SEA that could be used to fund. I would suggest it wouldn't be used to fund ongoing commitment, but if there was a request for some one-off injection of money to establish some kind of constitutional party to deal with the carnival in the future, then that would be appropriate to use some of that reserve to fund that. But if it was ongoing expenditure commitment, then the reserve would not be the best way in which to deal with it ongoing.
Councillor Stokes.
Yeah, and with regards to the 6,000, I mean, it is up to 6,000 as well. We don't have to utilise the whole, whoever is going to potentially run the carnival in the future. But there is always the option, as Richard has stated.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions in this area? I will come back to you, Councillor Baxter. I just have a couple of quick questions myself first. £161,000 for local plans. Can you just comment what local plans? That seems to be quite a lot of money. Which areas they're going to be in? The community governance review, £20,000 for the community governance review here in Grantham. As a member of the working group, this is the first time I've seen this number. Can you just let us know where that number's come from, where it's been benchmarked from? Is that just a random number, or is that a number that you've seen elsewhere? Also, my final point is on the street naming and numbering. The report says that this is being paid by developers. Actually, that's not really true, really. I mean, that's being paid for by residents of the district who pay developers. It's a tax on developers, so it's a tax on the people that buy the property of developers. So I'd like to just understand that a little bit more, actually, in that we're proposing a tax on people that do business in our district, which will just be passed on to our residents. So I'd just like to understand what the costs. I mean, it's raising £20,000. What's the cost here? Is it what are the charges? I'd like a little bit more detail on that, because that is a charge that will get passed to our residents that want to live and be the customers of developers in our district. So, Richard.
Okay, so I'll come back to the local plan in a moment once we've got the details up, because there's been a specific proposal put forward that breaks that figure down. Instead, in the case of street naming and numbering, this is a proposal brought forward by the service area. We're not presupposing that the developer will pass that cost on. I mean, obviously that's for the developer to determine whether that would be appropriate, or it takes it within its profit margin as an impact. But the current way this operates is all the taxpayers are contributing towards that service, rather than those that are directly accessing that service. And actually, as a service, that's pretty standard elsewhere, that actually a fee is levied upon the developer for that specific part of bringing a planning and a development to fruition. So that is relatively standard. But the principle here is that rather than every taxpayer contributing towards the service, the developer themselves are picking that cost up. Now, whether they choose to then impose it on the people who buy those properties, and not clearly that's something the developer will decide for themselves, rather than the council having any influence on that. The community review was a recognition. Obviously, the motion on council was relatively recently, and the work around the terms of reference for the group and the timescales for the consultation is still running through a process. This was a budget up to recognise that there will be costs that will be incurred in this work, and without any bid on the table, there would be no budget available in which to fund any consultation exercise and any other arrangements that need to be implemented. So this is a contribution, or hopefully an up to amount, that will deal with any costs that will be associated. Otherwise, we'll be eaten into established budgets that aren't set up for this purpose. This is a task and finish piece of work, and so it's recognising that there will be money needed in which to bring this forward. And as Councillor Baxter says, this is a general fund cost rather than any local one, because clearly the outcome of it may be that nothing materialises. So at this point in time, it will be a cost across. In terms of local plan, I think we're struggling to get it. I hate putting Nicola on the spot, but Nicola may have some detail behind it because it's from Nicola's area. Nicola?
Thank you. It's part of the South Kesteven local plan, and there's some subsections within all of it. So there's things like retail studies, open space studies. There's a whole range of studies that make up the local plan. So that's why it's coming out at the 160.
So it's not one area of the district, it's the whole district?
Yes.
Okay, Councillor Stokes, did you want to add some comments to that?
Yeah, I just want to add comments to the street naming. I mean, if you go to page 77, it's a £4 increase on the street naming. So I mean, you could argue that everything such as the section 106 could be classified as a tax to add on. I don't see it as a tax. I think it's just cost recovering more than anything, in my opinion, to ensure that less taxpayers within the district are covering the cost of that service.
Okay, thank you for that. So page 77 is the detail that I was looking for. Thank you. Are there any other comments? Well, Councillor Reid.
Thank you very much, Chairman. At the last Environment OSC, which a new member with part of the portfolio, electric charging points was brought up, and the initiative to actually double the facility, obviously in mind of the carbon footprint. We are working, I've spoken with Richard Wiles and indeed with Gary on it. It would be whichever way you look at it, it would be a budget bid of 40,000 less whatever grants we can get commensurate to this. If it would be similar to last time round, they would probably halve the costs, but we're not quite there yet. But I did want it noted that this would be, it's either a bid or indeed it's a net of the increasing parking charges one way or the other.
Thanks for that, Councillor Reid. Are there any other comments in the room on this area? I'll return to Councillor Baxter before we make progress. Thanks, Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. That's very generous of you. On the pay and display car park budgets, we're proposing an increase, a flat rate increase of 10% across the car parks. I note that on the 1st of April last year, just before the county council elections, Councillor Cook said that there would be a town centre parking review in Stamford. I wonder how that parking review progresses and whether or not this 10p increase is taken into account the review by the county and the district council.
Councillor Cook.
Thank you. Well, as I think Councillor Baxter knows, that town centre parking review is being undertaken by the county council, of which we will input into that.
Timescale?
So Councillor Cleaver and I have a meeting with our highways manager shortly, and I'll have further meetings with the highways portfolio holder to set that off.
Okay, if that can be advised to this committee when that's known. Councillor Wood, I'll return to you and then we'll make some progress.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's on fees and charges. So Councillor Baxter just mentioned charges. I've read through and I've got a anomaly in my mind here, and I can't understand why there are different charges for the swimming pools at Vaughan, Deepings, Grantham and Stanford. Surely as one council, all the charges should be the same. Thank you.
Richard.
It's just worth noting that those fees and charges aren't, the council isn't setting those fees and charges. They ultimately will be set by Leisure SK as the leisure provider. What the contract requires is that each year the council will set an upper threshold, which are the ones in the pack, but actually it's a financial decision and a commercial decision that the leisure operator will ultimately take. There's always been a distinction between the offer at each of the centres, and the fees and charges thus far have always reflected that different offer. So for example, if you go to Grantham, there are actually 4 pools that you can access, whereas obviously at Vaughan and at Stanford, it's a different experience. So the commercial operator has always taken that into consideration when they set their fees and charges. So what we've got in the pack is actually the upper threshold. So this won't necessarily be what the consumer will pay. That'll be determined locally.
Okay, Richard, I think that allows us to move on to the next area, please.
Okay, so just to finish off for the general fund, the final element is in respect of the companies. So the company funding proposals are included. There are three that are referenced, which are Environment SK, Invest SK, and Leisure SK. Gravitas does not feature in the proposals because Gravitas is a capital-driven project, and there is no revenue requirements each year for Gravitas. It's in a disposal and sale of assets, part of its business plan. So there is no requirement from Gravitas to have any funding put to it. In respect of Environment SK, it's a continuation of the grounds maintenance contract. The company has requested that there is an uplift in its fee to reflect its own inflationary pressures and its own pressures on its fuel and its utilities, and it's on its workforce pay and remuneration, which is to be expected. So there was a proposal put forward for 25,000 uplift, which is reflected in the figures. As Councillor Knowles has alluded to, the special expense for Bourne has been taken out of the specification, and that's absorbed some of that increase. So the year-on-year shift on the figures is 17,000, and that reflects the removal of Bourne SEA. We are in conversations continue with Environment SK, and they're doing some further work around their business plan, and I think reports are coming to the Companies Committee at the end of the month, which will talk a little bit further about their outturn position for the last financial year and also the pressures they are facing going into next financial year. So we'll wait and see what comes from that meeting, but at the moment in time, that's the indicative funding levels for Environment SK. Invest SK is also featuring on the Companies Committee agenda for the January meeting with some proposals around how it operates going forward. But for the moment, it's still a continuation of the core funding level of 370, which is primarily to drive the salary-related costs of Invest SK and some residual grant monies available to them to deliver grants to external bodies. So in the main, that's an as-is situation for Invest SK. Finally, Leisure SK is a bit of a moving feast with the changes, both in terms of the impact of the restrictions on how it operates and also the changes around the 4 centres. The business plan that's been updated is actually showing a relatively stable position financially for Leisure SK next year, which translates to it won't require at this point any further funding from the council, but won't be yet in a position where it'll be demonstrating operating surpluses. But the direction of travel for Leisure SK is an upward one. So if you recall, a year ago, there was funding put into Leisure SK to allow it to start trading in its first year. The proposal for next year is no funding will be required, and we'll wait and see what happens from 23-24. The only funding requirement for Leisure SK is in respect of business rates, which is where there will be a requirement on Leisure SK as the operator from each of those sites to pay the residual amount of business rates. And you may be aware the government have extended reliefs to certain sectors for next year, particularly hospitality, retail and leisure. So Leisure SK will attract a business rate relief of 50%, but there will be therefore 50% that will be payable. So the proposal is that the council will continue to contribute towards that through a fee to Leisure SK, but that's not related to its performance. That's related to the fact it's operating from buildings. So that's the only requirement, and that's 250,000. But again, I think that one it will be kept under review as we move forward, and whether that changes, obviously that will be put through the Companies Committee at that point. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this area? Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. On all of the companies, I wonder if you could say in each case whether or not the companies are making a surplus, and if so, is there likely to be a dividend to the council? And if so, has that been taken into account in these figures? On the Invest SK, you say that some kind of recommendation will be coming forward later in the month. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can knock it on the head. But Are the figures for Invest SK Limited in here in case nothing happens to Invest SK, because there's no increase for inflation or anything else? Is it just kind of, it's in there as a, this is what we would do if we weren't going to do anything else about it? I know it's difficult to write reports about Invest SK when you don't quite know what the future is. So I wonder if you could comment on that, and if it were knocked on the head, would that 370,000 be likely to be needed within our expenditure budget for the things that Invest SK does that we need done as a local authority? And then finally on the business rates for Leisure SK, nothing was said in the first part of the report, unless I missed it, about the impact of the discount in the business rates for the hospitality, leisure and retail sector of 50% relief. Does the 50% relief to the hospitality, leisure and retail sector have an impact on the council's overall finances? Forgive me if I'm supposed to know that already, but if you could reiterate, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Richard.
So in terms of the financial activity of each of the companies in the current year, as I say, Environment SK, my understanding is a report which was going to Companies Committee will comment on the current year. There's clearly going to be a focus on the 2021 outturn position, and members may have already been made aware of that through Companies House, but there will be some report detail around the outturn. I'm not able to comment on 21-22. We're still in the financial year, so I don't think Environment SK themselves are projecting a particular view as to what the outturn may look like, but we're certainly not predetermining any dividends within 21-22 or 22-23 within the budget proposals. That's not to say it won't happen, but in the direction of travel is not something around Environment SK we're seeing, and therefore reflecting it in the proposals. Invest SK is a company limited by guarantee, so dividends aren't part of their constitution. It doesn't feature in that way. They're not a profit generating organisation. They're a company limited by guarantee, not limited by shares. The funding is primarily to drive economic development activity for the council in the district. So the conversation around the vehicle is a slightly different conversation to whether the activity it's doing and the outcomes it's achieving would still be pertinent if it was brought in-house. So I would suggest the budget allocation is still needed. It's just more of a conversation about whether or not, as an arm's length company, is that the best way in which to deliver that activity, or is it better within the control of the authority? And again, I think that's part of the conversation that will be had at Companies Committee. Leisure SK is a company limited by shares, but hopefully I've explained that the business plan is not projecting next year a surplus, but it's not projecting a deficit. Therefore, no fee is being asked for at this point in time, but that may change. In terms of relief generally, it's something called Section 31 grant, which is where the government will reimburse councils where it has direct influence over receipts that would ordinarily have been received by the councils. It seeks to reimburse the councils for that income that won't be generated. And I meant to mention that in the overview. You would have noted that the business rate multiplier for next year has been frozen by government. So 22-23 business rate multiplier is the same as this year's. The government stated that back in October. So that growth we would have expected to see through the receipts will be reimbursed to us via something called Section 31. So we'll be no better or worse off as a consequence of where the government involves itself in business rates.
Are there any other comments and questions about this area? I just have a couple of quick comments. First of all, obviously, you mentioned the reporting of numbers. Obviously, these numbers are in the public domain on Companies House. If you can just confirm to the wider committee that their tax year is aligned with the council, so that they can make comparable estimations with the figures. I think that is the case now. Also, on a more general point, I note from the Companies Committee that all three of these businesses are working on their business plan. They're all under development, I think, is probably a fair way of describing it in different situations. So therefore, given that, what confidence do we have in these numbers? I think everyone on the company's committee expect revisions to all of these business plans for all sorts of different reasons, COVID, changes in policy, changes in all sorts of different reasons. So without going into those reasons, given that all of the business plans are going to be worked on heavily in the next year, what confidence do we have in these numbers? And if there are material changes, are we back again? Are we back again to discuss those? I'm guessing the answer to that is yes. So I suppose there's a question for Councillor Cook there and for Richard. Thank you. Councillor Cook.
Well, obviously, I mean, in terms of the companies and where they are, I mean, obviously, you know, we bring forward the information, we work with as a team of directors in the best interest of the company. And obviously the business plans are constantly under review, as I think we all know, because we come to the companies committee on a regular basis, and obviously as different things arise. And, you know, I mean, the companies are all set up for very different reasons. I think we've had this conversation before, and obviously Invest SK will have a conversation at the next companies committee about the future direction as to where it should sit. And I know views have been expressed across the chamber in terms of where we believe Invest SK to go. And I certainly have a clear idea as to where my thoughts are on that one. In terms of Leisure SK, Leisure SK was set up in order to sustain our leisure offer because the market had failed, and obviously is continuing to fail in terms of providers taking on leisure centres at the present time. I think it's also giving us a bit of extra control at the present time as we look to improving our leisure offer across the district. Similarly with the Environment SK, and I suppose it's the more political comment, is that you know, generally for me, it's we step in when the market fails, and that's a conservative approach. And I think there's certainly a review to do on Environment SK as to the long-term running of it, and whether or not it should continue, and whether or not the private sector could actually look to take on parts of our contract as the best ideas there. But obviously we continue as many of us are directors in this chamber to monitor the performance of the companies and managing the budgets, and also working with the finance team here at the council as well in overseeing it. And obviously if any material changes were to happen, then obviously it will be reported through as the usual process. I don't know if Richard wants to add anything else on that.
Richard?
Yeah, and just pick up the point you asked at the start, which was about the alignment of their tax years. The only one that's transitioning across is Leisure SK. So it will have a 15-month financial year, which will be March 22. All others are in line with the councils. Their tax years are April to March, so that's the only one. But yeah, in terms of the proposals, of course, what we're presenting here, if you like, is the client side. This is what the council at this moment in time, or sorry, the executive are proposing are the funding levels for each of the companies. Now, the Leisure SK dialogue is slightly ahead because that business plan review has been done relatively recently, which is why the proposal is on a more confident footing. The Environment SK is undergoing a review because the pressures on the labour side workforce is very real and is still being felt not only in that industry but across the industry generally. So they are living that pressure at this moment in time. So I think that one, if any of the three, is probably the one that it may need some further conversations of whether the council needs and is in a position to able to supplement the funding that's being recommended at this point in time to ensure that service is delivered next year.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think that was confirmation that there's some estimations in here. Are there any other comments of that? I'd like to make some progress then. Moving on to the housing revenue account, Richard.
So the HRA, the revenue side for the HRA is in a more positive position, I would say, from when we sat here a year ago. We're only in a position where we could set a 1-year budget for the HRA because there were pressures on the working balance and the reduction we were seeing on the 30-year business plan for the HRA, which was reducing that down to a very low level. There's been a lot of work undertaken this current year to reposition and stabilise the HRA. That's been further helped by the rent setting levels that are available to the council, the rent setting guidance is set as a September 2021 CPI level. So that is significantly higher than was previously built into the 30-year plan, which obviously has a financial benefit. And of course, any residents that will adversely be impacted from that have access to universal credit, discretionary housing payment support and other welfare support as well, and will ensure they're signposted appropriately. I think the caveat for the HRA, both on the revenue side, but more importantly on the capital side, when we get to that part of it, is around the stock condition survey and the repositioning of spend on void properties in terms of planned and reactive. So I think there's further work to be done on the HRA, but generally we were able to present a 3-year HRA summary, which is the first time we'll be able to do that for 2 years. So I think that's a positive movement. We've reflected some of that pressure around voids at the moment. So we've prudently increased the void rate from 1.5% to 1.8%. So that's just to build some buffer into the HRA budget proposals. Now, of course, the team are working to get that shifted back. And I think the aim is to get it to 1% over a period of time. So we've kind of built in some breathing space to allow that movement to be impacted on. But as I say, that shift around what becomes the repairs and maintenance on the revenue side and then shifting that more onto the planned maintenance side will be a financial benefit to the HRA. So I would suggest that what we're presenting is a positive position and reflects the work that's been undertaken, but clearly the stock condition and the further work around the improvements that are needed to the stock may mean that this summary and more importantly, the capital programme for the HRA may need to come back to council at some point next year to reflect the changes that are needed. Thank you.
Okay, comments and questions on the HRA. Councillor Moran.
Hi, thank you. I see there's this overall increase of 4.1% on the rental income budgets, which is good, really. Says there's an increase in projections for rental income of 650,000. Is that 650,000 based on the properties we currently have rented out, or is it based on our housing stock? The second thing was the increase in the void turnaround times. I do understand how during the past year or so why void turnarounds would increase. What measures are being taken to not only get void turnaround times back to where they were pre-COVID, but to improve on that? What's being done about that? Because at the moment it's resulting in a loss of income, and we do seem to have, looking at the report that's going to Cabinet tomorrow, we do seem to have a horrific amount of properties that are voids at the moment. And the final thing was, how confident are we that we can get these void times reduced significantly?
I think that's a question for Councillor Reid.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, well, let's start with really the good news. I'm very confident. The reason I'm very confident is I've got a very competent housing team now, and the Assistant Director, beyond the procurement of a proper new housing management system, which is his first priority. His second one is voids. And it is in the report of Cabinet tomorrow, some of the mechanisms that we have, and they are most importantly that he holds both weekly and monthly meetings with the tiered people in the voids team, which in turn are working with repairs and in the improvements teams as well. The one common thread that is holding us back somewhat, now that we've got a competent team together, is the state at which often we get the properties back. And our staff actually are really quite disturbed sometimes at the way in which we get the properties handed back when they come back to us. To that end, that something else that's recognised is in that a revised tenancy agreement application form for the future, i.e. those tenants that are, theirs will be updated, and indeed new ones will be under a new undertaking to try and address some of that terribly difficult when you're not holding, as you do in private accommodation, a deposit, but we are working to that end. We are also addressing within the next year, well, I say the next year, we've already started to address the long-term voids as well as the short-term. So we've had a push at getting as many of the short-term ones as we can back into circulation, because obviously it's clearly rent revenue loss. And indeed, we are making inroads into some of the major ones which need complete refits and often some structural work. And the other question that you asked me was about, wasn't about budgets. What was the other question? Oh, yes, exactly. Yes. So that is on the current rental income that we get on those. So that again will improve in value as we get more properties back on stream. Huge challenge, but with the mechanism that we now have in place, we're well on track. And I look forward to reporting back. And while I've got the floor, Chair, yes, I would like to confirm we will be coming back after the stock condition survey is sourced, because we need to actually balance where we are with an immediate, a short, a medium and a long-term view of how we address our housing stock improvements and repairs. And that is balanced with a seesaw of what new build we can manage to yield. We have got a programme, it is still ongoing. I do have to say I'm very anxious, nervous about it at the moment, because I don't know the findings of the stock conditions survey, but I promise I will be both truthful and transparent with all members.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Whittington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, it's about paragraph 4.2 and the proposed rental income increase in the rents to our social housing tenants of 4.1%. Now, I know this is driven by a government formula, and it is sort of CPI plus 1%. So really the figure is kind of, sort of set via a national formula. But I'm thinking to myself, this is going to come as quite a shock, I think, to a number of our social housing tenants, a lot of whom are on sort of quite limited incomes at the time when we know inflation, is potentially going to be around about 5-6% next year. We know national insurance contributions are going to be going up. We know the fuel costs are going to be going up next year as well. Says I've heard that things, fuel prices could be doubling. And potentially, I know that there could be an awful lot of cost pressure coming on to some quite vulnerable people who are, our tenants. And I know, Richard, you refer to some of the help that is offered, but I obviously you refer to universal credit, but also to some sort of discretionary amounts that we have, because I know we have some discretionary reserves as well. Just wondering if you can give me a bit more background around that, and also in terms of, because I have a feeling we could see quite a big increase in demand from some of our tenants actually asking for some help and support, because, Richard, you referred to signposting people on, and presumably that's to both Universal Credit and potentially also to the Citizens Advice Bureau and those sort of agencies. I was brought up in a council house in Grantham, and I know what it's like when you're in a family where income is limited. An increase like this potentially could have an impact upon a lot of people. And I do have a few concerns. I know there's not a great deal we can do about it, but I'm just thinking what we can do to help mitigate the impact and to help our tenants, our very vulnerable social housing tenants. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Richard, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as I said in the introduction, the rent setting guidance from government is clear that it's CPI plus 1%. The date the month in which CPI is taken is September of each year. So we are relatively constrained in options. And of course, the rent income is the lifeblood for the HRA. The HRA needs the rental income in order to invest and fund the stock itself. So it's a kind of a sequence of events. So it's unfortunately, without taking the opportunity, compromises the offer that we can make and the investment we can make in the property as well. As we all know, it's a ring-fenced account. It needs to fund itself from within itself. So unfortunately, that is the dilemma that we face. Table 13 does extract what it does mean for tenants depending on the property type in which they all occupy. And it will range from £2 a week up to £4, although for 6 beds is only 0.1% of the stock, so it's only a handful of properties that will be affected. Over half our tenants do have some financial support through either universal credit or some interventions that we locally can make, but of course they are, in terms of the support we can give, that's only one-off temporary support to allow the customers themselves to either undertake some proactive household budget management support, which we offer and the CAB and other third sector bodies undertake, and to help tenants navigate the way through the pressures that they're going to feel. But yeah, we all know there's a national conversation about some of the pressures that aren't this, but all contribute into the mix. So we do know who these tenants are. We do know the situations they are in through the support they're currently getting, and we will be making sure that they do access and they are signposted to where support is available to them. But unfortunately, it is a direct impact of the guidance the government have set that we need to take forward the rent increase as it's set out. But there are some interventions we can do, but they are limited. We would expect the welfare support system to be enhanced next year as well as part of the annual budget announcements by the Chancellor. So the universal credit and the allowances available to tenants, we would expect to increase as well. So there should be a proportionate, to some extent, offset between the rent increase we're proposing and the access and the level of funding the tenants themselves will receive as a consequence of the changes.
Thank you. Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank Councillor Witterson for raising one of the points I was about to. It is a concern. Just moving on though, the £75,000 at the bottom of that paragraph, is that the amount that we think we would benefit from with improving the void situation, if I can put it that way? Is that the easiest way? But that's not the total amount that we're losing from empty properties, is it? I wouldn't mind having a look at how much we think we are losing from the total amount. But picking up on what the Cabinet Member, Councillor Reid, said, I hear what he says about being disturbed at the state that some of the properties come back in. I've got to say, as a ward councillor, I've been very disturbed in the past at the state that we hand properties to, sometimes, not always, but I have seen, real areas of concern. So whilst I want to see the voids time come down, I really hope it does. I hope we will achieve that through efficiency and better, and dealing with the problems and the repairs better and quicker, not taking shortcuts and not doing those repairs. Because I'm sure we'll all agree that, if you hand the tenant a property in good order that has been painted throughout, I'm not sure we're going to go that far, but that's in good order and all working, it's much more likely that it's going to come back in a decent state and that people will have pride in where they live. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, just to clarify that number reflects the change between the 1.5 going to the 1.8. So in terms of the calculation, if you look to the HRA summary in Appendix A, 1.5% of the rent roll is roughly about £380,000. That's how much we would reduce the rent roll by to reflect the void rate. By increasing it to 1.8, increases that to about 460,000, and that's your difference of 75. So it's the financial impact of the marginal increase on the void rate.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to make some progress if there are no more comments in the room. I suggest we take items 4 and 5 together, the capital programme, including financing and reserves and balances. I think we can take those together. Richard.
Okay, so the capital programme is at Appendix C. It's made up of general fund and the housing revenue account. The highlights to note, so in total for the capital, £14.4 million capital programme. That's primarily because at this point we've introduced the leisure centre refurbishment into next year. But as the report suggests, the reality is that may stray into 23-24, depending on the timing and the duration of those works. And again, worth noting that the following year after the refurbishment is when the council will incur the impact of the borrowing. So depending on the timing of that, it's critical to understanding when the general fund revenue position is affected by it. So that's the primary element of the capital programme for next year, and that's wholly at this point in time demonstrated as a borrowing requirement. But of course, there's further work to be done in terms of receipt generation, capital receipts, which may mitigate and offset the need to borrow to the extent that's currently being shown. Within the programme, we've got, as has been referenced earlier, the replacement of fleet. We have in-house fleet for both our street scene vehicles and also our pool cars, and on the housing side, our vehicles for the HRA. They're reflected in there. The Disabled Facilities Grant, which is government funded, passported through County Council, that's included in there as well. And the more recent announcements which we're featuring in, which is again is government funded, majority government funded, is the Future High Street Fund, which sits on line 12 of the capital programme for the general fund, and that a line share of that is falling into 23-24, 4.6 million, but an element of it is within next year's budget of 823. There's also some proposals, capital bid proposals around renovation of assets. We've talked about on the revenue side, 400,000 going in and a further 150 going in for the leisure centres. But there's some significant works requirements at the Stamford Arts Centre in terms of the roof and internal modifications and renovations. So there's 450,000 that's been proposed to go forward for that. And then members will be aware that SALIX funding had to be returned to government in respect of energy efficiency initiatives. But there's an expectation there'll be a further round of that funding available next year. And on line 4, you'll see there's a decarbonisation scheme and a bid gone forward there for 261,000, which is to build the business case up and to have the council in a position where it may be able to access some further funding if that's decided at that point. So that's kind of the highlights for the general fund. From the HRA side, as Councillor Reid has already said, we do expect a number of these to change once the stock condition survey comes back. So because what we're expecting around the stock condition survey is a reprioritisation of the works that are needed on the stock. So what we've got here in terms of all those schemes, communal rooms, door entry, exterior refurbs, etc., are based on legacy information or existing contracts that are already on the ground and being delivered. So we would expect most of, if not all of that allocation where we haven't already committed works to be realigned on the back of the stock condition survey findings, where we'll need to reprioritise the funds available and the urgency of the works that are coming back and informing us. So that is an as-is position for the HRA. The other change is on the housing development investment. That's been scaled back to an ambitious programme, or an ambition of 3.8 million next year, a 3 million programme the year after, and a 2.8 million programme the year after that. And that's a reflection of the capacity and the financial position the HRA is in, and it's the level of the scale of the ambition alongside the prioritisation of the stock investment around the existing assets that can be managed from the team and the available resources. That is a scaled back level of funding for new builds than we've seen previously, but it is perhaps a more honest reflection of what will be achieved going forward for next year. The HRA proposals are fully funded from the HRA themselves, so there is no borrowing requirements for the HRA on this ambition. So overall, a £14.1 million set of proposals there for the HRA. So combined around about 30 million programme in its entirety. So finally, the reserves, obviously there are reserves for general fund, there are reserves for the HRA. There are some proposals coming forward to move some monies around for the general fund to really reflect some of those emerging pressures. So the proposals are to reduce down the stabilisation reserve from about from 1.5 million. And that monies will be reallocated out to the regeneration reserve, and that's to fund the continuation of the St Martin's Park development and some of the emerging cost requirements to bring that site to development. So proposals to move some money into the regeneration reserve. There's a proposal to replenish the maintenance reserve, and we've talked several times about the urgency and the need to make sure that we're investing in our assets. So there's a proposal to put some money into the maintenance reserve, and there's a proposal to reallocate the money from the commercial reserve and to remove that reserve, but to allocate the money that's in there into the investor save reserve, which is a reserve the council has access to pump prime initiatives to release savings thereafter. So they're some of the key changes that have been proposed on the general fund, with reference that the climate change reserve would stop because it's going into mainstream funding, so there's no need to keep that reserve ongoing. And then in respect to the HRA, less movements being proposed, but members can see the working balance is now at a level that's sustainably acceptable. We tried to get that reserve to between 10 and 15% of its operating costs, so we're back into that area. So that's a positive move, and we continue to use the capital receipts reserve, which we do need to use to fund new build, because we've got an agreement with government that we use pooling receipts from sales of council HRA assets to fund new build. So there's a need to keep using the capital receipts reserve, and that will fund that new build investment. And then the lion's share of the funding will come from the major repairs reserve, which is a government required reserve to fund investment in housing stock. So that reserve will continue to be used to fund the HRA capital investment. And they're the key changes on that. Thank you.
Councillor Wharton.
Thank you very much, David Chairman. I welcome the investment in replacing the CCTV cameras in the town. Over the last press release, they were responsible for 600 either direct or indirect arrests within the district. With this in mind, and the fact that towns are growing, are we considering to extend CCTV systems across the district? And also, are we going to approach Lincolnshire Police or take money from 106 fund to increase the systems district-wide? Thank you.
Karen Bradford.
So a slight change there, Chairman. In terms of looking at the current provision, I think we're always looking at different options as to where we can further install around town centres and looking at what we can do. In terms of the Lincolnshire Police, I know that through regular meetings that I know our Chief Executive has, we've had conversations with them about actually co-locating our CCTV service with Lincolnshire Police at the Grantham headquarters to actually make it more accessible and actually to work better for us as an organisation. Which is a really positive step forwards. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Karen.
Thank you, Callum. Yes, so we've got a meeting coming up only next week, actually, to look to actually see if they can host a CCTV units and the team at the Grantham Police Station. At the moment, we've already got 2 lines into the Grantham Police Station, which goes into CID and the operational team on our camera network. And also it would be safer for our staff who work the 24 hours, 7 days a week if they're in a more secure environment for monitoring of the cameras. So just to support what Kellen was saying, and we're always looking for developments and of the system. It is an effective system. It's known to be more effective than other methods, but we're really positive that the police and ourselves are working together to see if we can get a good outcome on this one.
Thank you, Chairman. If I could come back on that, I mean, the CCTV system is in effect.
If you can speak into your microphone,
Yeah,
please.
sorry, CCTV system has been in effect since the early 80s. I mean, they are, even today, responsible for hundreds of arrests in London. So I think they're a vital tool for our growing district. Thank you.
Councillor Whittington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question refers to the table on page 81 of the pack, Appendix C, around the HRA cattle programme, and it's good to see that the 30 million investment there, which is proposed, and I'm guessing it's. But my question is, obviously, a lot of this is dependent upon, tied up with the stock condition survey. I'm guessing that on that basis, a lot of these numbers are at the moment estimates. What would we do if the stock condition survey came back and actually said, well, things are actually slightly worse than we thought, and it's not 30 million we need, but 40? I mean, it'd be great if it came back and said, oh, actually, we only need 20 because we provide 30. But on the other side, if it did just come back worse than we assumed, what flexibility would we have? And my second question, it refers back to, let's find it, on page 27, the new homes bonus. I'm assuming that this money, that this is not a ring fence grant because it's being used to finance a whole variety of things. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Richard, if you want to speak to the new homes bonus, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, and just to comment on the stock condition, clearly what the programme, as I said, as part of the introduction of this item, is that this is predicated on the stock condition survey findings coming back and the council reprioritising its spend. Now, clearly, the council is required and will want to invest in those assets, and it's about what's affordable. It's got the constraints of affordability in the same way that the general fund has. The HRA at the moment isn't in a position where it needs to borrow, but it has the opportunity to borrow if it's so required. So it will come back to the priorities of the council and the pace in which it can respond to the stock condition survey. I mean, I would expect that, given the level of investment the HRA has put into the assets over many years, then we wouldn't expect the stock condition to be significantly away from where we are currently. But clearly, how we're aligning our funding at the moment is relatively blind without the intelligence from the stock itself. So we would expect these numbers to shift. We would expect the prioritisation of the funding levels to shift. Now, whether it significantly changes the total amount is yet to be seen. And of course, that's wrapped around capacity of the teams to deliver multiple programmes concurrently and the ability in which to do so. So we'll wait. I think we'll wait and see as to what it says, and obviously those conversations will be had through members, through the various committees and through council. In terms of new homes bonus, and historically, the new homes bonus receipts have gone straight into the local priority reserve, and the council has used that reserve on a number of occasions for a number of one-off initiatives, and they've used that reserve to fund capital expenditure and also to inject monies into one-off initiatives and one-off projects. So the consequence of new homes bonus finishing, which is the direction of travel, is that local priority reserve will become a reducing figure over time, and at the moment with no visibility on what and how much can replace it. But as I say, that conversation's being played out nationally, so we'll have to wait and see what that means. But the implication will be our reserve levels will reduce fairly quickly, actually, over that period of time. In the prime of new homes bonus, we were receiving over £3.3 million a year because we had particular buoyant growth in the area, and the scheme was very much rewarding that kind of growth. Now, without those sort of numbers going into our reserves on an annual basis, then quickly we will see a reduction on the reserve levels.
Can I just push you on the stock conditions, Sue? Perhaps this is a question for Councillor Reid. Obviously, there'll be an element of priority setting when that comes back. What is the process for priority setting that, and how will that be scrutinised by this council?
Thank you very much, Chairman. So, as I've mentioned again this afternoon, and I continue to mention, the process will be that is immediate and urgent. Then there will be a short, medium and long-term plan that we are going to work through. This is something that I'm regularly in conversation with both the director and assistant director on a constant basis, and I'm looking that the long term will actually probably take us to a 30-year span, but the beginning of it will be certainly in the next year. The Director of Finance has alluded to the fact that there has been, as we all know, a severe lack of investment over several years. And I'm therefore expecting probably the results to be quite eye-watering to begin with. We are aware of it, or we are aware of what we know. We're not aware of the stock condition survey. Over half of it is now completed, and we're not going to wait for the whole of it. We'll be making preparations starting next month on the knowledge that we know. And we will be bringing it back with our action plan and our address of how we're going to roll out the investment that will be needed, and indeed the mechanism that we will be using will obviously take the usual tranches. It will go through rural and communities. It will also come up under governance and audit, and it will, so those will be the usual channels that we will be talking through the activities within the HRA improvement programme.
So just to confirm, you're confirming, obviously critical enhancements aside, obviously they need doing straight away, but the less critical things will be scrutinised and priorities set at scrutiny committees. Thank you. Councillor Dilks.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Councillor Reid a little bit more, if he'd say a bit more about that, because if he's able to, because and I do accept, and I hear what you're saying about lack of investment over the years in our housing stock, and perhaps Richard could comment as well. It's and I'm not an accountant, and I've probably missed something big here, but the rent is 25 million on the HRA next year. We're going to spend 14 million investing in the HRA, or we're expecting to, of which 3.3 million is coming from reserves. But that still leaves, if I've got this right, in the order of 40 million in reserves, in the housing reserve. Is that about right?
Richard?
The point I'm making is it seems like the money would be there to fund these major investments that we may need to make.
In fairness, I think that we were agreeing with you. It's just in setting the priorities as to where we would start. And fine.
Yeah, I mean the rental income primarily is there to pay for the expenditure. So if you think of that as an income and expenditure account, the rental income is used in the first instance to fund the day-to-day services of the HRA. And that's made up in the HRA revenue summary. Any surplus from that goes into the reserves. And you're correct. As at March 22, we're projecting the reserves to be at 41 million. That's higher than we had anticipated, because if you recall, the current year's programme had in it a significant new build scheme of 15 million, something like that. So the direction of the reserves was significantly downwards because we're using the reserves to fund the new build programme. So of course, in the absence of the capital expenditure being delivered at the levels at which we budgeted, then clearly there's going to be a bounce back on the reserve levels. So they are higher than we would have expected them to be because of the shift on the new build programme. being reduced down. So that 40 million is there to fund the HRA not only for the next year, but it's for the next 30 years. So we have to have a 30-year mind's eye on the HRA. So there is a resistance to spend everything to fund the immediate problem, because of course we're looking at this up to 2050, 52 type area. So we've got to be mindful of that longer term projection. But clearly where the programme has not delivered at the levels that we've budgeted, that puts money back into the reserves, which can then be reallocated and used for different purposes. So yeah, there is money available, which is why I made the comment. There's no borrowing requirements in the HRA, but the HRA could consider borrowing if it wanted to. But with the level of reserves, there's probably no need to.
Councillor Dilks, you want to come back on that?
If you'd allow me to, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Richard. So I suppose my question really then is, at what level would you start getting worried, you know, that if the HRA reserves fall below 40 million, I think they're probably projected to slightly, but at what level, you know, what would you start considering, you know, when would you start getting worried that we haven't got enough for the next 30 years in that reserve? Do you know what I'm saying, Richard? That's probably not a fair question, but
Richard,
what level will I be worried? I think, I mean, one of the reserves is capital receipts reserve, and capital receipts reserve has to be used to fund on building or adding stock into the HRA. So that's probably one that we shouldn't include in those figures actually, because it's got a particular requirement against it, and that's running at about £7 million. So you're then left with about 33 million. I mean, in the past, our reserve balances have been around, probably we wouldn't want to go much below 15, something like that. We tried, the working balance needs to be a proportion of the expenditure, and that's pegged at about 10 to 15%, and expenditure is running at about £20 million. That needs to be around 2.5, something like that. But I wouldn't, anything less than half we've got now would be probably a direction of travel.
So rewording Councillor Dilks' question, were we to take a big chunk out of our reserves in the housing revenue account, there would be a modelling process that we still have sufficient reserves to last us 30 years is the benchmark. Is that the report that we would see if we were to take 20 million or 30 million out of our reserves? We would expect to see, Councillor Dilks would expect to see a report modelling that our reserves are still resilient at that stage. Is that right? Can you confirm that?
Yes, so working with Councillor Reid and Councillor Stokes, what we would be presenting are a number of options around what the stock condition survey is telling us, and we would financially model the impact and implication of taking each of those options forward and what it means not only to the reserve levels, but for me, more importantly, what it means to the 30-year business plan. Because I keep coming back to that, but that projects into the future what those cost pressures may be. Now, as Councillor Reid suggests, there might be a huge spike in those requirements in the short term for stock condition, but they might plateau out after that. Conversely, it might be the opposite. It might say for the next 5 years, I'm looking at Andrew because I don't know if he's got more visibility of what's coming back, but it may say for the next 5 years, investment's fairly subtle, but there's some real cliff edge issues for the stock, which may take you into 2030, 2040. So I think we'd all model, Andrew probably got a better answer than me. So I think we would model all of these alongside and present those as part of the option package for members. But Andrew has got a comment.
I have a related question actually, but Andrew Crofton, if you want to.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll try a better answer following Richard. I think what's important in terms of an HRA business plan is clearly we're going to start off with our baseline information from the stock condition survey. What will be important from that is our score in relation to the decent home standard, because that's absolutely the basic standard that we must meet. So that will be the priority for us over the next few years in terms of addressing, any shortcomings there. Beyond that, we've got some flexibility in terms of what we anticipate or expect the sort of lifespan of the major property components to be, so kitchens, bathrooms, roofs. We will have some flexibility with that. So in developing the 30-year plan, as Richard has mentioned, we will have peaks and troughs, but as long as that's sustainable over the next 30 years, the clearly the HRA will be okay. I'd anticipate we will continue, and it's reflected in next year's capital programme that's been put forward, increased expenditure in relation to fire doors, gas safety, these sorts of works. But beyond that, we will have some flexibility, and I think I wouldn't lack confidence in terms of the rent roll that we've got and the stock size that we have, that our housing revenue account is sustainable long term. The decisions for members, in consultation with tenants, will be how we profile that spend and what we prioritise in the sort of short and medium term. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a related question to that actually. If you look on table 17, page 25, we're projecting a new build programme of 67 properties over 3 years. Given that we sell around about 50 properties a year, give or take, with the right to buy, that basically is programming in a declining stock over the next 3 years. So the numbers are going in the wrong direction here. We've got a declining stock, a lower rent roll, and an eating into reserves. These are the kind of things that you would model in, and you would expect. Would your model expect to see that turn around? Because obviously, if you're selling 50 a year and building 20, your rent rolls are going down.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the case, and that's been the case for many years. On average, I mean, I think it was only about 3 years ago we sold 75 properties. We're not keeping pace, and frankly, will never keep pace with the number of sales against what we can invest in, unless we go into more of an enabling role rather than trying to build ourselves. Because the pace in which we do that, the land availability, et cetera, is probably not sustainable for us. But our 30-year plan absolutely builds in our working assumptions of new build, or not so much new build, that's probably additional units and additional housing stock, be it whatever mechanism we use in which to achieve that. And that is the lifeblood of the 30-year plan. The 30-year plan requires us to continue to replace and add stock into the HRA, because the direction of travel otherwise is that it will just be a reducing rent roll over that period of time, and arguably the stock that's left from that activity is probably the stock that's going to need the most resource and financial support to keep it to the standing which we want it to be. So, but we've never been able to keep pace with the right to buy sales.
Okay, so I'm pleased that the model's resilient. There's obviously a decision being taken here about scaling back how realistic we are with building properties. This is obviously a question for Councillor Reid. Can you talk to us about why that decision has been taken to scale back our ambition on building? Is that a recognition of the realities of the market, or what are we looking at there? Because there's been a change of ambition there. Councillor Reid.
Yeah, well, there's two things, one of which has been widely discussed as to where we are with right to buy and the properties that are sold, and where we are with capital employment and improvements. But the other thing, which is very, very important, that we as a district council need to address, and probably many councillors, indeed I wasn't aware when I took over the housing portfolio, is the fact that we have 30 of sorts sheltered housing schemes. Now, a district of our size should really have 8 to 10 sheltered housing schemes that are absolutely fit for purpose. Ours have got mixed housing within our schemes, and so that's something else that we've got to start to introduce a change. Now, we're already starting with the first one, that we have Swinegate, that we were going to actually, was going to be new build as replacement of stock. We have an initiative that we are going to make that the next sheltered housing scheme, the first one that will be fit for purpose. But what that will do, that will also give us a displacement, because it will give us units, but the displacement will be that the new units will go to sheltered need, and that though properties that are vacated that they come into will provide obviously new additional homes. So we've got that programme also to balance. We have had difficulties across the last couple of years, as you well know, with directorate, with people to be able to actually convert. And indeed, there's been a great nervousness as to where we are with stock condition. And there is many members that come up and tell me of many things. For my own ward, we have houses that still don't have felt, let alone insulation in their roofs. We have a big programme to work through to actually place. And as I've said before, to balance also with new build. And, you know, Richard has said this afternoon that he's comfortable with the level of our balances at the moment. When we've worked out through this particular programme, I don't think he will necessarily be terribly happy with where we are with the balances. But what I need to do is I need to balance with councillors' views and with their consent and their consultation, along with officers, the programme at which the improvements can actually be rolled out.
Fine, so it's a capacity issue that's taken that decision. Okay, fine. Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two bits of questions. The first is about housing. So
I would prefer if you ask them together, if that's
really
feasible.
That's going to be confusing for you and for everybody else, but you're the chair, so fine. So on the housing issue, I want to say that it's disappointing that the stock condition realisation over the last couple of years has almost brought to a halt the housing development programme. Instead of saying, Councillor Cook is on record of saying 500 over 5 years. Forgive me if I've got those slightly wrong, but he said a large number over 5 years, and that was 2 years ago. And instead, it looks like next year we're going to get about 20 or 25, which is still more than in previous years. It works out, well, we've said 67 houses over the next 3 years rather than hundreds, almost 100 a year that we were promised. But we do need to bring the stock up to scratch. So having said that, last year we said that we were going to have a budget of 10 million for house development. New houses was going to be 10 million this year, 14 million the following year, 18 million the year after that. That's now down to about 3 million per year. We also said last year that in this financial year in which we're in at the moment, we were going to spend £3,885,000, so £3.8 million, similar to the number in this pack, on energy efficiency improvements. On top of that, we had the grant, we had the new homes, I can't remember the carbon decarbonisation grant of £1,000 for improvements in our own council housing stock, I believe. So can anyone tell me, of the £4.8 million that we were going to spend on energy efficiency initiatives this year, how much have we actually spent? And are the figures for the forthcoming years realistic? Those are my, I could go on, but those are my housing revenue comments. I want to say that there was a mention of Salix, so about the Salix funds. We're going to go back to the next round. Yes, we did. We had to give back £1 million, no strings attached funding. The only string attached was that we actually spent the money, but because we couldn't spend the money because of the bottlenecks in the industry, we've given back £1,000 to Salix or the government. This year, the money comes with strings attached. So it's not as good a situation, but I'm pleased that we've still got some ambition in that direction for investments. The Invest to Save fund was mentioned. Not all the Invest to Save funds that we've invested to save have been successful. I'd particularly draw attention to the advertising initiative, where we've spent £30,000 so far and got absolutely diddly squat from it. And the street lighting, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think the street lighting Invest to Save money has been as but as good as we thought it was going to be. Finally, I'd want to say on paragraph 6.1, it's not exactly what we hoped for, not exactly what we expected, but I am delighted that we have at least finally put something in the budget for Deeping's Leisure Centre improvements. And even though it's not the all singing, all dancing leisure centre that we were promised over years, at least we've put £10 million in the budget. And I just hope that does actually happen, and that is one promise which will be kept. And so congratulations to all involved in that process for finally, after 4 years, bringing that to fruition. Thank you, Chair.
Richard, can you?
Yeah, I'll pick up some of those, but I'll probably just defer to Gary on the Salix funding because they'll probably be able to give an update. But I'll just talk quickly on the items you've raised. The central heating and ventilation replacement programme. Our latest forecast is 3.2 million for this year, and we're working with the team to identify any carryover that may be required for next year on top of the 3.8 that's been requested for as well. That actually will be coming to the Finance Committee on the 15th of February as part of the budget monitoring update. So further questions could be asked at that point if that's needed. Invest to Save. Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's a checkered history of some projects coming to fruition and delivering what was set out to achieve, some less so successful. Some of them have been an element of commercial risk that's being taken. The street lighting one is the one you particularly referenced. The actual savings from those are being reinvested back into replacement of LED lighting. So it's a circular saving. Well, again, Gary can talk to that, but my understanding is that programme is working successfully and is continuing to be rolled out. The pace of that, I couldn't comment on, but it is in place. I think there were the points I probably could comment on. Gary, sorry. Yeah, I'll just refer to Gary. That's okay.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think on the Salix, you were just making a comment that we've in the process of returning that £1 million because of the industry issues. There is ambitions that we can apply for future grants, but as you say, the nature of the requirements and terms and conditions on those will be different than the previous. I think that was just a comment on that. In terms of street lights, they have installed the first batch of the LED street lights, but I don't have the figures with me, but it's small hundreds have been installed now, and it's on a phased program. It's not a quick, short program because of the amount of upfront investment. But as Richard's explained, the savings from that are funding the future rollout of those LED lights. So, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is going back. I know we've sort of discussed housing and the fact that our housing stock is going down because the right to buys are greater each year than the new builds. I know that sort of housing associations provide social housing out there and seem to be built. Have we thought about sort of any sort of joint venture agreements with housing associations, because they seem to be able to sort of put up developments of mixed housing, social housing, affordable housing, whatever. I'm just thinking that that there may be some expertise that they have that we potentially could access to kind of increase the total number of social housing units in the district. Thank you.
Andrew Cotton.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, certainly we're always open to collaboration with any partner. I think that there's a couple of fundamental differences in terms of housing associations, and their development programs and local authorities. The first is, of course, housing associations don't have right to buy, so they can build in the knowledge that that asset will be theirs, forever. The second is that housing association rents are pretty much 10% higher than local authority rents typically. That's the case in South Kesteven and across the board. You're also, a related point, you're seeing a number of housing association mergers that are producing some massive landlords, 60,000, 70,000 stock, which clearly gives them huge sort of borrowing capacity. So we're, as a social landlord, we're in a different place than housing association partners. That's not to say we can't and won't work with them, and certainly we'd be open to doing that. In terms of our ability to deliver significant development programs, we're in a different place than housing associations at present.
Okay, are there any other questions and comments in the room? Councillor Moran.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the right to buy. When this first came in, this right to buy many moons ago, my understanding of it was that it would give council tenants the opportunity to actually be homeowners, so that they don't need to worry, they can own their own house. And because they'd rented so long, they would get it at a discount. I don't know what that discount is, and I don't know who decides it. I don't know whether it's decided by central government or whether it's something that we put in and is in their tenancy agreement when they first rent from us. But my understanding was that councils, when somebody bought a house from a council, the council would be left in a position that they would get enough money from that sale in order to build another house. So that's obviously not true. Otherwise, if we sold 50 houses, we'd be able to build 50 houses. So I'm just wondering if there's any leeway in increasing the percentages of what it costs somebody to buy their property in future, or whether it's something that is literally carved on a tablet and that was left on a mountain at some point. I'm getting lots of shaking heads.
A lot of head shaking in the room.
The discount is prescribed by government. It's not a local discretion we have. It depends on how long that individual's been a tenant, not necessarily in that property, but a tenant, the type of the property, and also the value of that home. So there's a cap on the discount that's available, which is applied to. So there's a market value done on the property, and then it's discounted down, and the tenant will pay that residual balance depending on those criteria. There's also a restriction that if the property is sold within a period of time, then the discount has to be repaid back to the council as well. So there are restrictions in place, but it is not within our discretion as to how they are applied. It is a prescribed legislation, and when we adopt it. There's something called 1-for-1 receipts, where the council can hold back some of the receipt it receives from the sale if it reinvests it back into new build. So previously there was a pooling arrangement where the majority of the receipt had to be returned to government. The council didn't hold the receipt from the sale, it was returned. But there's something called 1-for-1 receipts, which this council's adopted, as many have, which so the council, through that reserve, holds back an element of the receipt, providing it invests it into replacement stock, which is why it's important the council does have an investment programme around new properties.
Okay, are there any other questions from members about this part? Then I'd like to move on to the final part, which is basically just any other matters and returning to any other points that anyone may have about this or any section before we close the meeting. Councillor Dilks.
Mr. Chairman, mine is on the any other matters. That's where I thought we'd actually got to. I've just got 3 short points. I'm happy to put them all together. Although I would just say on the right to buy discussion that we've just had, I'd be interested to know how many, and it's a piece of work, that might be done in the future, how many of those former council houses in this area have actually been sold on to private landlords, because that's happened in many other parts of the country, and particularly in London and high expensive property areas. It's quite a big problem. But anyway, that's for the future. My 3 points are, 1, council tax concessions, the concessionary schemes. You'll know what I'm going to ask about, and it's the special constables concession that we agreed last year, albeit I believe for 1 year, which hasn't actually cost us anything yet, because the PCC and the councils haven't reached an agreement yet on how it will work. Hopefully it's going to be backdated to cover the current year, but I'm just asking, I don't see anything in the paperwork, and is it the right time to ask, are we planning, Adam, to continue that for another year? Hopefully we are. And let's hope that it actually does start next year. Secondly, the overall impact of COVID on this council's budget, I'm just disappointed actually not to see it. I have asked for it before, but we must know at least what COVID cost us, say in 2021, but we haven't actually been given that figure at all. And yes, I know it is going to possibly come up at a scrutiny committee in the future, but when we're doing the budget, it would be good to know what is the overall impact on this council's budget of COVID to date, the net sort of cost. We've had costings, loss of car parking charges and all the rest of it, but we've also had some government grants, quite a lot of government grants. And whilst I'm asking that, are we expecting any sort of government reimbursement for lost car parking charges? That's sort of the second point. And the final point I'll just make is on the loss of the ward allowances, the ward allowances scheme and rolling it into the community scheme. I would just ask, if perhaps Adam or colleagues could give what's the thinking behind that decision in presumably determining that that's not the best value for money for that particular money. Those are my points. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Stokes.
First point with regards to the special constables discount. I mean, there is a report going to full council regarding the local council tax support scheme in the end of this month, and it is still included. So that will be going forward. On your last point with regards to the ward member grant scheme, decision we made is because at this moment we've only utilised 20%. Councillors in this room have only utilised 20% of the budget this year, and there'll be a mad rush to the end of the financial year. But I can't see it being fully utilised this year. So the thought process is we can signpost people to the community fund and the organisations that have been used for that. So.
Okay, thank you. On the overall impact of COVID, that is actually in the work programme for the Finance Committee. Richard, if you want to comment on that and when you think that piece of work may be ready to analyse.
Yeah, I mean, some would argue we're not at the end of it anyway. We're still in that restriction, as we all know. I mean, this budget is a forward-looking document, so I would suggest it wouldn't feature 2021. In fact, the Governance and Audit Committee report on the outturn, I've referenced it over lunch, it heavily talks about the COVID impact actually, but I appreciate it's probably not joining all the elements. And I think we talked to the last Finance Committee about some relatively subjectivity around what is in a COVID impacted budget line, because it's also about opportunity costs where officers have been distracted away from the work they would ordinarily have been doing because they've had to be diverted onto some of the more immediate pressures. So it is hard to quantify in absolute terms, but I absolutely appreciate there's been some direct grant funding the council's received, but which we've consistently reported on throughout 2021 and in the current year. And there have been pressures in the system as well in terms of unforeseen expenditure that we've had to incur as a result of it. So, and we're still going through it. Income losses, I think we've talked about income losses quite a lot at the Finance Committee as well. There has been a government scheme for reimbursement of income losses, which are where it affected things like car parking, markets, the arts, things like that. And the council has taken full advantage of those reimbursements where they're absolutely available. But it wasn't a pound for pound replacement scheme. There were a number of elements to it, relatively complex to work through. So it wasn't a like for like. But as the chairman says, it is on the work programme for the Finance Committee, and we will bring forward some further information around it when we're at that point.
Thank you. Councillor Whittington.
May I just say thank you for that answer, Richard. I do appreciate it. But can I just clarify, have we actually claimed a reimbursement or been given a reimbursement for loss on car parking?
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one of my questions was quite similar to the one that Councillor Dilks asked around COVID, and you know, and obviously we're out of the. I hope we're out of the worst of the lockdown, but potentially COVID is going to have quite a long tail. I think. I'm just wondering if there's, because what I'm doing is I'm looking down at the financial risk register now on page 87, and some of the risk analysis on the budget on page 91. And I know it's difficult to sort of quantify a lot of these numbers, and a lot of stuff that you put in risk registers can tend to be quite sort of subjective, you know, interpretations and whatever. And I know it's difficult. For instance, on page 88, number 5 on the risk register, you know, refers to the fact that lockdown restrictions might have a negative effect on economic recovery, which then has a knock-on effect on our income levels. And I know this is really difficult. I'm guessing if there are still any more cost impacts that come out from COVID and its long tail, that it would have to be funded somehow from within our reserves, because I'm assuming that's the only place potentially it could come from, because it seems to be doubtful the government will give any more COVID grants out. I just wonder if Richard could just comment around that. Thanks.
Richard.
I mean, in terms of the income losses reimbursement scheme actually ended at the end of June 21. So from that point onwards, there's been no recognition from government across the sector that further losses of income will be reimbursed by government. They're now wholly on our shoulders. So when we've gone through this budget process, we've tried to reflect the reality of where we are currently on income and project forward what that might look like, and will it get back to pre 2021 levels? We'll need to wait and see. But Councillor Whittington's right. There is no specific grant funding that's been made available to local government now for funding directly or indirectly as a consequence of any restrictions or any other adverse impacts. It's now wholly on the council to deal with that. So, but the budgets have tried to reflect the new levels of budget that we may be achieving. But yeah, that's primarily why the risk register exists, because it's highlighting that this is still an area that may change going forward. But we can provide more information at the Finance Committee if members want to see some more about what funding the council has had.
I have a related comment to Councillor Whittington's comment. The risk register for me is too high level. It's an excellent report and I think it's well structured, but the weakest element is the risk register. And this is something that I've mentioned in Finance Committee as well for our quarterly updates. I think members that may not necessarily be taking quarterly updates, I think would have benefited from a much more detailed risk register, risks on all areas of the accounts. Thankfully, you've answered many of the questions today, but members kind of don't know what they don't know here. And I think I'd have liked to have seen a lot more detail on the risk register. I know that it's something that in Finance Committee, we've asked you to work more on. That's just an observation. Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. I looked through the report for mentions of St Martin's Park, and perhaps I should have brought this up under reserves, because at the bottom of page 26, it mentions the operational costs of St Martin's Park are 430,000. I'm not sure if that's operational, the operational costs of a static site, or whether that's anything happening. So I think the question I'm asking is, when do we start on St Martin's Park? When do we start doing whatever we're going to do with it, turning it from an old factory into a new multi-use scheme? When do we cut the ribbon, or when do we start digging, or break the ground, whatever? So I'd appreciate some comment on that. Secondly, where will I find in here the costs or dividends of the cinema building? Obviously we've got a cinema that may or may not be producing an income, and then we've got the university centre and the downstairs retail property available that is costing us something. I don't know how much it is costing us in actual costs rather than loss of income. Thank you. Finally, I just wanted to say, I know it's a long afternoon and a long meeting and I make lots of comments and so on, but this year I found it easier to navigate the report. I'm not sure if that's because there's been any change in the report or whether I'm just finally getting to grips with how to read it, but I really appreciate the time and effort that the officers and the cabinet members have put into to making it understandable and to make the figures honest and understandable, and it seems a lot less fantastical than it has in previous years. So that's a compliment to all involved. Thank you.
Thank you. So Richard, a couple of comments there about, do you mean operating, do you mean carry costs or operational costs on St Martin's Park?
So St Martin's Park, as we know, is as an asset that's been acquired. It was undertaken on internal borrowing, so there's a cost of that borrowing, and the decision taken at the time was to fund that borrowing cost from the regeneration reserve, which was created at the time of the acquisition. So the regeneration reserve is taking the strain on holding St Martin's Park at this point in time. So it's not going through our service budgets, it's all been dealt with from the reserve. So that narrative is explaining that for next year, the costs of retaining St Martin's Park is going to be 430. That's for its ongoing security, business rates, and the framework back to it, the MRP, which is associated with the borrowing. So that's how that's going to be dealt with. That will come forward over the next financial year for further decisions, which will require some further works to be done to the site to get it ready for disposal to the developers. So I would expect to see more traction and more reports coming forward in respect to St Martin's Park over the next period. So,
are you saying that we haven't budgeted anything for developing St Martin's Park?
So the next stage of St Martin's Park is demolition and then sales on to the developers who have come forward for parcels of the site. So the further cost the council will be asked to spend on the site will be demolition to get it ready for then the developers taking it on, and then the council will start to see capital receipts coming into the capital programme over the period of the sales.
Councillor Cook, do you want to add some comments to that?
Yeah, I think just to add some clarity to what Richard said. So obviously it's got the outline planning permission now. The next stage will be the exchange of contracts in terms of the various aspects of the site. As a district council, obviously we will have a further cost in terms of demolition, which will be shared with the other landowner. But then otherwise, the various aspects of the site will be sold to the various developers. So us as a district council won't be developing any individual part of that site ourselves. We will be taking the capital receipt and the surplus in terms of the sale of the various aspects of that site.
And so that's likely to be cost neutral in the year that it happens.
So the demolition is anticipated to start this year, and let's not doubt, I know we're in a public meeting, but the council will be making a significant, and I can say a profit from that site.
And the other comments about the cinemas numbers?
Yeah, so a year ago, there was a bid that was put forward for the budget that was approved by council of £75,000, and that was the operational costs of holding the asset across the road. That's not the cinema itself, that's the other parts of that, because there are business rates now liable on the site for the units, the empty units and the space above the cinema, and there's the operational cost of holding that asset. So that was a bid that went in last year and approved, so that's now in our core budgets. The income from the cinema itself is also receivable, and that's built into the budgets. So that's an ongoing revenue stream to the council. The budget doesn't anticipate any units coming forward for rent. So whilst they stand empty and the council's incurring the cost of those standing empty, we haven't anticipated any income in the next financial year from them.
Okay, are there any other comments and questions about any area of the report in the room? Councillor Crawford.
Just one quick comment. I'd like to concur with Councillor Baxter. I would just like to thank all the officers for their explanations today. It's made following the budget a lot simpler for those of us who aren't accountants. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to echo those comments as well. Well, moving forward, I'd like to propose a vote to recommend the report together with the comments and the answers to the questions made today. Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Whittington, all of those in favour? Any against? And any abstentions? Okay, so that report is recommended for the Cabinet. Moving on to item 8, is there any other business in the room? There is no other business in the room, so at